Today, we're taking a fresh look at the ancient practice of tithing, but maybe not in the way you've heard it before. We're going to unpack a cyclical model for giving that's actually based on biblical patterns that are even older than the laws most of us are familiar with. So let's dive right in.
So let me ask you this. Are you sure you're tithing correctly? Most of us think it's pretty simple, right? You give 10% of every paycheck. But what if I told you the original blueprint suggests something totally different? A pattern that's more of a cycle, more intentional, and has a radically different focus for where the money is supposed to go.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking way back at 3 ancient priesthoods to find the core principle. Then we'll uncover this really surprising pattern in Abraham's life, see how that translates from an ancient harvest to a modern paycheck, and finally, we'll build a practical 3-month cycle that answers the biggest question of all: who truly gets the tithe?
To really get this right, we have to go back, way back. See, the principle of tithing runs through 3 key priesthoods in the Bible, and understanding them is absolutely the first step.
Okay, so you've got 3 main orders. First, the order of Melchizedek. You can think of this one as the timeless, everlasting priesthood. Then you have the Levitical priesthood under Aaron, which was a temporary system, kind of like a shadow, set up just for ancient Israel. Now here's the key. The New Testament actually models Christian giving on that first one, the timeless one, not the temporary system. And that's the whole point right there. If we really want to understand Christian tithing, we can't just look at the laws given to Israel under Aaron. No, we have to go back even further to the original story, the interaction between Abraham and the priest Melchizedek. That's what sets the true, everlasting pattern.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Abraham's life actually shows us a very specific, repeated pattern in how he handled his income, or what the text calls his possessions. Let's break down what that blueprint looks like.
Take a look at this slide. You can see a clear rhythm here. After Abraham's first 2 big gains in wealth, the scripture says he just called on God, basically built an altar. But after the 3rd major gain, recovering all that stuff from the war, he does something totally different. He gives a 10th, the tithe, to the priest Melchizedek. And then, after his 4th gain, he's right back to calling on God. You see it? It's a very distinct 3-to-1 cycle.
Now, this personal pattern of Abraham's wasn't just a one-off thing. It seems to have become the blueprint for a national law later on. The Israelites followed a pretty similar 3-year cycle with their harvest tithe. For 2 years, they'd use that tithe to feast and worship. But that 3rd year, that was called the Year of the Tithe, and it was all given away to the needy. The same principle is right there.
Okay, so how in the world do we apply these ancient farming and wartime ideas to our 21st century lives of, monthly salaries and online banking?
Well, the translation is actually pretty direct. Back then, income was a harvest, or spoils from a battle. Today, our income comes from our jobs, in the form of money. The core principle, giving from the fruit of our labor, is exactly the same. It's just in a different form.
Now, before we even get to the tithe, the source material is really emphatic on this point, pulling from Romans 13. Paying your taxes to the government is presented as a primary, non-negotiable command. It's like you can't even begin the conversation about tithing if you're not doing this. This is your first financial obligation, period. And just like the form of income translates, so do the people who receive it. The Levites, they were a whole tribe without land, so they were dependent on others. They represent the poor and disadvantaged today. Aaron the priest, well, that maps to full-time ministers. And the groups listed as aliens, fatherless, and widows, that's a direct parallel to today's homeless, helpless, and most vulnerable people in our communities. Okay, let's put all these pieces together into a practical model. If the Israelites had a 3-year harvest cycle, what does that look like for someone who gets paid every month?
Here it is. It's a simple 3-month cycle. First, you've paid your taxes, right? Then you set aside 10%. For the 1st and 2nd months of that cycle, you use that money for what the Bible calls feasting. But on the 3rd month, that entire 10% is given away. Then you just repeat the cycle.
But what does feasting even mean today? It doesn't mean you have to book a trip to Jerusalem. The New Testament is clear. Our bodies are now the temple of God. So feasting is about gathering right where you are, with your family, your community, and intentionally inviting the poor and needy to share in that blessing with you, and to glorify God together.
And this brings us to the most critical part of the whole cycle, that 3rd month, the year of the tithe. Where does that money actually go? Because the distribution is very, very specific.
First, a small piece, just 1/10 of that tithe itself, is set aside for full-time ministers of the gospel. And to be really clear, that's only 1% of your total income for that month.
The rest of it, the massive chunk, the other 9/10 of that tithe, goes directly to the poor, the homeless, the helpless, and the vulnerable. That means 9% of your total income for the month is directed straight to them.
I mean, this chart just makes it crystal clear, doesn't it? The overwhelming majority, the lion's share of the third-month tithe is directed towards caring for the needy. This isn't about funding big building projects. It's about justice and mercy for the most vulnerable people among us.
And the criteria for that little 10% portion is strict. It's for ministers who have fully dedicated their lives to ministry and have no other job. In other words, they've made themselves financially dependent or poor for the sake of the gospel. A pastor who also works a second job, well, according to this model, they would be a tither themselves, not someone who receives this part of it.
So here's the kicker. The responsibility for making sure this distribution happens correctly, it lies with you, the giver, just like Abraham. According to this pattern, it's up to you to make sure that 90% gets to the poor and needy, and that the 10% portion goes to ministers who actually meet the criteria.
So let's just recap the whole process one last time. First, you pay your taxes. That's step one, non-negotiable. Second, you set aside your 10% tithe and you use it for feasting and fellowship for 2 months. And third, in that third month, you distribute the entire tithe according to that 10-90 split.
And that leaves us with a final thought to really chew on. If this ancient, cyclical pattern is the true blueprint for giving, what would actually change? What would be the real-world impact in our communities if the vast majority of our collective giving was intentionally and directly funneled to care for those in the greatest need? It's a really powerful question to think about.